Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore, where today's subject shall be the Red Talons, and their first chapter master, Autek Mor. Oh, and incidentally, as a point of logistical propriety, the Red Talons should not, under any circumstances, be confused with the Crimson Talons. Despite their similar paint scheme, their similar looking iconography, and their similar names. This should be attributed fully to GW burning the last 5 grains of creativity they had in a bonfire about 7 years ago. As despite all indications to the contrary, the two chapters have no relations. So then, the Red Talons. They take their name from Autek Mor's flagship during the Horus heresy, which was, of course, named the Red Talon, which in turn took its name from the icon of Clan Moragul, which was in turn created by Autek Mor when he single-handedly took over the Ra-Gulan clan's Leviathan on Medusa shortly after the 10th Legion had arrived on the planet to be reunited with their Primarch Ferrus Manus. Thus, the old 10th Legion, occasionally referred to as the Stormwalkers, was no more, and in their place was the Iron Hands, named in honor, of course, of their Primarchs, Iron Hands. This also saw the mass reorganization of the Legion along the clan lines of Medusa, this being why Autek Mor, a Terran-born officer, created his clan Moragul. And his choice of home, the Ra-Gulan clan's Leviathan, would prove out to be quite prophetic. The Ra-Gulan clan, you see, were rebels, ne'er-do-wells, bandits, raiders, whatever derogatory epithet you would like to lay at their feet would probably fit. And Clan Moragul was to continue that tradition, albeit in a somewhat more organized manner at least, as the clan became a gathering place for outcasts. Those for one reason or another who didn't fit in anywhere else in the Legion, due to ambition, due to differences of opinions, due to simply having a bit too much of a rebellious streak, due to being too independent, or simply having a very different set of values to the rest of the Legion. Autek Mor was the only officer capable of keeping them all under control, and facing in more or less the same direction. A feat he achieved, appropriately enough, by ruling over them with an iron fist. Absolute discipline, absolute loyalty, absolute obedience. Any infraction, any insult, no matter how minor, was met with the strictest chastisement, up to and including death. But Autek Mor was not simply a tyrant, he alloyed all of this with honor as well. He never executed anyone, he simply challenged them to personal duels of honor, and delivered whatever punishment was deserved. Whether it be a fresh scar to remember the offence by, or a more permanent beheading as an example to others. This was considered a bit brutal even within the Iron Hands, a legion not exactly famed for its soft touch. Autek Mor even gained a bit of a reputation for cruelty, but in reality, nothing could be further from the truth. Autek Mor took on those whom nobody else could manage. He kept control over those who would otherwise rebel. It was not callous cruelty that motivated his actions, it was simply the appropriate displays of authority and strength to keep them in line. The necessity of this leadership style, however, escaped the majority of the 10th Legion's other Iron Lords, which gave Autek Mor a most unhelpful reputation, to the point that even the Primarch himself distrusted the Iron Lord of Clan Moragul. Some would even go so far as to suggest that the relationship between the Primarch and Autek Mor was outright hostile, or that Ferrus Manus questioned where precisely Clan Moragul's loyalties lay, with the Primarch, with the Legion, or with someone far closer to home. This suspicion was made evident yet again during the Istvaan V punitary campaign. The Gorgon wanted to go down to the surface of Istvaan to punish his treacherous brothers, and he wanted to do so alongside his trusted clan, the Averni. Whilst Clan Moragul, slated to take part in the subjugation, was still in transit. Which of course turned out to be a bit of a stroke of luck for Autek Mor and his ship the Red Talon, though he did not see it as such at the time, in fact disproving his Primarch's uncharitable interpretation of his character and his actions. Autek Mor and his Red Talons would throw themselves into battle with near unmatched fury. By the time the ship arrived, the second wave of Loyalist reinforcements had already arrived and revealed their true colours. The fleets and the ground forces of the Alpha Legion, Night Lords, Iron Warriors and Word Bearers had already engaged in the wholesale slaughter of the Loyalist forces. But instead of ordering his ship to hang back, to assess the situation, or even possibly to flee, abandoning his legion and his master, Autek Mor ordered the Red Talon to dive directly into the heaviest of fighting, attempting to cut straight through the heart of the traitor formations in order to establish an orbital position to recover their brethren. It was a hopeless gambit, and Autek Mor knew as much. The man was a veteran of the Legion since Terror. He could have judged the outcome of the naval engagement in a millisecond, and yet still he tried. Even when the news of Ferrus Manus' death was broadcast by both loyalist and traitor frequencies alike, he still made the attempt. And his ship paid dearly for it. Both flanks ablaze, his prow reduced to molten slag, and countless weapon batteries knocked out of action, the Red Talon was faced with a simple question: stay and die pointlessly like so many other loyalist ships, or make a break for space. Autek Mor chose the latter, vowing that he would bring vengeance upon the traitors wherever he could find them, in whatever capacity remained to him. And that was no idle threat. Autek Mor took stock of the resources that remained to him. The Red Talon was still an enormously powerful warship, albeit much reduced. Repairs would be necessary, time would be required, but she would return to her old glory. Meanwhile, her significant complement of Iron Warriors would have to serve as her weapons. An arsenal that would be added to by scattered remnants and survivors of Istvaan. Those ships of the multitude of fleets that had escaped destruction at the hands of the traitor vessels, and fled into the warp to God Emperor knows where, scattered to all the seven winds of the Immaterium, and the bow waves of the ruin storm even now beginning to build. These survivors found themselves trapped behind enemy lines with no realistic prospect of escape, and even if they could make it through the warp, they had no idea which planets were still Imperial. These shattered legions would rally around strong leaders, those with intent, either simply to hide and survive, hoping for rescue or an opportunity to break out into the Imperium. Others would organize to strike back against the traitors in, for example, guerrilla campaigns. Such was the efforts of the now oh-so-lauded Shadrach Meduson, another son of Medusa. Even if made of significantly softer metal, the bloody, as he is called, bloody failure more like. Despite all the praise heaped upon him, what did Shadrach Meduson truly accomplish? Oh, he almost assassinated a few Primarchs. Or in other words, he failed, wasting precious resources and skilled personnel in chasing a laughable goal. Assassinating Primarchs. He might as well have tried to cage a son. And what of his other deeds? Skulking, striking at a supply line here or there, reducing the Iron Hands to guerrilla warriors. A mild annoyance at most, that's all he amounted to, a gentle distraction to the beast barreling down on the Imperium's throat. His weakness was his undoing. His own men, his Iron Fathers and Lords, rebelled against him, built themselves a robot, they did, in the likeness of the Primarch. Shattered easily enough by Shadrach's saviour in green armour, Vulcan. And what did Shadrach the Great do then? Did he, the bloody, purge his ranks of this ridiculous coterie of idol-worshipping traitors? No, he forgave them, only to be betrayed by them again later, and having his own pretty little head served up on a soft silver platter to the sons of Horus. His accolades have more to do with his demise than his victories. Operating in the same rough span of time, Autek would not make the same mistakes. He marshalled his limited resources very carefully and picked his targets for maximum effect. He would not strike out at supply lines, thus robbing the enemy of a billionth of their total resources. He would instead strike at the source of those supplies. The Red Talon would target planets, specifically those that had recently fallen to the traitors, those closest to the leading edge of the enemy's offensive. These worlds would offer the shortest possible lines of supply for Horus and his dogs, but would also often be the least offended, either stripped of their garrisons for the war effort, or having had them destroyed by the traitors themselves as they seized it. Weak, vulnerable, and valuable targets. Thus the Red Talon, and soon an ever-growing number of survivors and loyalists, Astartes and Solar Auxilia alike, flocked to the cause. By destroying starports, burning agricultural complexes, or smashing industrial facilities, Autek Mor's men denied the enemy vast quantities of supplies, men and materiel. Furthermore, they forced them to rebuild and peel away frontline troops to stand guard against the savage predations of the Red Talon. Now this was, of course, a bloody strategy, and the worlds that had fought, who had resisted the traitors, those were unfortunate sacrifices. To visit yet another tragedy upon the valiant few who should have been allies was not easy. But those worlds simply represented targets of too great an import to ignore, regardless of the heavy heart with which the deed was done. But those worlds who had surrendered, those who had willingly, gleefully thrown in their lot with the traitor scum, for those worlds there would be no mercy, no measured approach, no targeting of military installations or control of collateral damage. The Red Talon's bombardment bays were heavy with nuclear ordnance. and Mor could see no better possible use for them than sending a message loud and clear to all traitors that the Iron Tenth still fought. One of the first traitor holdings to feel the unbridled wrath of the Red Talon was the Genocide system. It had surrendered a year or so earlier without a shot being fired in its defense. Indeed, they had even hailed the traitors in places as heroes. Clan Moragul was about to make them pay for this mistake in their loyalties. Having been left with only a bare minimum security detail, Genocide was woefully unprepared for the fleet that now descended upon it. A handful of minor orbital platforms were swept aside with contemptuous ease, and the Red Talon and its newfound fleet of allied warships began to land on the planet below. They would not simply bombard it from orbit for two reasons. One, orbital munitions was precious, and they were unlikely to be getting any resupply anytime soon. And two, everything else was precious as well. Munitions, fuel, raw material, food, water even, were all in short and finite supply for the crews and the soldiers of the Red Talon and its newly forged coterie of allied vessels. They had come to enact vengeance upon traitors, but they were as much raiders and pirates, frankly, as they were avenging angels. Assault forces spearheaded by the Astartes, foremost amongst them Clan Moragul and the Iron Warriors, were deployed to every major city, every industrial center or depot area, and every starport. They would grab what they could and crush whatever resistance they faced. Solar Auxilia and other Astartes forces would also take part in a lesser capacity. Albeit no less vital, speed, precision, and violence of action were all paramount. The Red Talon was under absolutely no illusions that it could withstand an organized counter-assault. If it and its allies were caught stationary in orbit above a planet, they would all be doomed to death and destruction. It was a matter of causing as much damage and disruption as possible in as little time as possible, allowing the fleet to make a safe escape to the nearest warp translation point and then strike out against the next target. And Genocide would be the standard that they would all be measured. The planet had surrendered. It should still have been heavily garrisoned, defended, and prepared for an invasion force. They should have had a better opportunity than most to resist even an Astartes incursion, at the very least for long enough for allies to arrive. But as their beloved Warmaster had taken most of their men and materiel, they were a soft and appealing target. The PDF forces and Solar Auxilia elements that remained were crushed with contemptuous ease. And following the destruction of all major military forces, the strategic destruction and plunder was finished rapidly. The Iron Hands withdrew to their transports and shot off into orbit yet again. The people of Genocide dared to hope that they had been spared the worst yet again. Their planet had been ravaged, it had been raided, and severe damage had been inflicted upon it, but the major city still stood. The vast majority of its people were still alive, and the vast majority of its natural resources were equally intact. A few years and the planet would be back to full operation again, were it not for the gifts that Autek Mor's Iron Hands had left behind. In every major city, Every major population center and every major installation that they had visited, the Iron Fathers had left warheads of the nuclear variant, encased in specially prepared containers, with layers upon layers of nuclear waste and radioactive materials. For these were not simple atomic bombs that would level miles in all directions. They were also designed to aerosolize and spread radiation on as wide a scale as possible, and to suffuse the very ground and the very air with lethal levels of radiation. The Iron Hands were salting the earth, denying not only the enemy the immediate resources and manpower of a planet, but the planet itself. Gethsemane would become the blueprint for Autek Mor's continued operations, as he moved on to cripple world after world after world in the wake of the Traitor's advance. Remaining constantly on the offensive, Clan Moragul and its Iron Lord moved from one target to the other. As a matter of survival, they never allowed themselves to be engaged by the pursuing forces that were sent back to hunt them. No matter how tempting a seemingly random fleet might be, Autek stuck to the idea of attacking only pre-designated and researched targets, making sure he could not be trapped or drawn into any engagement from which he did not have a plan to either win it or extricate himself. To ensure this, he also instituted a policy of seizing high-ranking enemy officials from every planet raided. This happened on Gethsemane and every target thereafter. And whilst the Iron Hands might not be known for subtlety, they do know how to ask very persuasive questions. And every planet struck gave them information on dozens of other targets. They even began piecing together a rough map of the enemy's counter-insurgency operations, seeing what they were pursuing and where they might be found. Autek started steering his fleets in the direction of the enemy's pursuit fleets, intercepting their quarry and allying together with them, thus picking up yet further Astartes and Solar Auxilia elements, building a fleet. Multiple fleets, in fact, as Mor's growing armada became capable of not just attacking multiple planets, but also carrying out sporadic interdiction activities against enemy trade and logistical lanes. First and foremost, these raids were to gather yet further intelligence, as Autek Mor had already long since decided that merely striking out against enemy shipping was simply not going to have much in the way of an effect. But he could count himself lucky that he had elected to do so anyways, as one particular convoy of ships, attacked by Imperial Fist elements that had now attached themselves to Clan Moragul and the Iron Lord, discovered intriguing plans and blueprints, and the location of the world that the convoy was heading towards: Bodt. On the surface, the planet didn't seem all that noteworthy. A fief world of the World Eaters Legion. It was a known source of Solar Auxilia equivalent personnel for the World Eaters, but mortal soldiers were never considered a particularly great threat by the Astartes. It also had modest industrial capabilities, at least enough to support the so-called gun clans that were raised from it. It had also supposedly been a minor recruiting world, but nothing really to drag Autek Mor in its direction. It would have been a more heavily defended target, riskier, maybe even possessed of naval elements and a significant garrison. Assaulting Bodt would be dangerous, not necessarily because of the planet's own defenses, but because of the time it might require, and the rewards appeared to be quite paltry. But the Imperial Fists had relayed that they had captured something quite interesting. Not only was the planet devouring a significant quantities of resources normally associated with the elevation of space marines, but there were also data logs that piqued Autek Mor's interests personally. He refused to elaborate on what exactly it was that he had discovered, but the main strength of Clan Moragul, along with the Imperial Fist elements that had intersected the convoy, and significant solar auxiliary forces, were all diverted towards Bodt. And once again, fortune favoured the bold, as Bodt's singular moon, which was normally locked in a very long elliptical orbit, was now as close to the planet as it was going to be in a very long time, and heading directly towards it. Normally, of course, the moon would miss the planet, and then continue again on its long elliptical. But Autek Mor saw an opportunity, ordering his vessels to marshal all of their most potent orbital bombardment weaponry, by now a precious and highly limited resource, and instructed the ships to strike out at the moon. Millions of tons of high-explosive ordnance hammered into its surface, and barely even disturbed its orbit. But that slight disturbance was all that was required to place it on a collision course with the planet. Under normal circumstances, that would be the job done right there. The majority of the planet's human populace would be dead, its infrastructure and industry leveled, or so severely crippled that they wouldn't get back on their feet for decades. Sure, there would be survivors, especially if the planet was indeed a rallying point for Astartes, but they would have no way off the planet. Yet, despite this, Mor gave the order for the fleet to race ahead of the moon and commence assault drops directly on to the areas of highest confirmed enemy activity. Any other commander and his officers might have been tempted to start asking questions at this point, but Autek Mor had a long and proud history of dealing sharply with dissent. And thus the Loyalists descended on the planet in massed formations with armor and Astartes and solar auxiliary elements, to be met by over 11,000 World Eaters, but of a type that none had ever seen before. Most of them wore power armor, or at the very least a semblance of power armor, but they were all completely berserk. They were not assaulting with any degree of discipline or organization. They were maddened zealots hurling themselves at the Iron Warriors' gun lines. And yet, once in close quarters combat, they displayed a remarkable aptitude. It seemed as if the Iron Hands had somehow stumbled upon a massed gathering of veteran World Eaters, pulled back from the front line for some reason, and yet their armor, their weaponry, chain axes, bolters, all seemed freshly stamped and produced. It was a mystery that only Autek Mor knew the answer to, and he wasn't sharing. The enormous assault was in essence a diversion, drawing to it the World Eaters, the thousands and thousands of Gun Clan's members on the planet, estimated to be at least 50 to 100,000 strong, not to mention elements of a Titan Legion as well. Whatever else was going on, this was most assuredly no backline mustering world, or even some small-scale recruiting planet. Their Iron Lord had feared and told the rest of the Loyalists as much, that he thought this world might be able to play a greater part in the crusade. That was all the justification he would give, and he now seemed to have been most thoroughly justified in doing so. The Iron Warriors were barely holding out despite a numerical advantage, despite having their fleet in support, despite being able to strike out against the enemy with armor and aerial support as well. And again, under any normal circumstances, officers would have started asking questions as to why they were fighting on the planet, even as the moon grew larger and larger in the sky above. Mor, meanwhile, brought with him an elite formation, spearheaded by his own Gorgon Terminators, a special way of adapting Space Marines to Terminator armor that Ferrus Manus had thought to be his own unique invention, but which Autek had somehow managed to reverse engineer, having presumably peeked into Daddy's secret notes on more than one occasion. They were directed towards an underground vault of the Dark Mechanicus, where Mor ordered his bodyguards to stand guard at the opening of the vault beneath, whilst he descended into its depth alone, and no one should follow. For the third time, there really should be some questions asked, but there weren't. Even as the fighting above ground grew more and more ferocious, as the moon grew larger and larger in the sky, no word returned from the Iron Lord. Even his Gorgon Terminators were beginning to wonder if he had been killed down there, and if they should violate his orders to go down after him, or if they should simply resign themselves to death as the moon made planetfall. But with only an hour or so to spare, their lord finally emerged, his armor cut and dented and bruised and sliced open. And in one of his mechanical arms he was carrying a sealed canister with the insignia of the God Emperor's gene labs on it. Deeming his purpose on the planet achieved, Mor simply spoke a single word: withdraw. And so the Iron Hands and Imperial Fists and Solar Auxilia did, racing back to waiting transport ships and getting off the planet mere minutes before the cataclysmic impact of the moon. Standing in viewing galleries aboard their warships, the Iron Hands and their allies witnessed the last few fiery moments of Bodt, as the dying planet took its world-eaters and its population and its secrets with it to the grave. Even as the Red Talon and its Iron Hands contingent turned away and made for the nearest warp translation point to continue their campaign. As for the secrets of Bodt, very few knew of them at the time. Even fewer know of them today. But fortunately for you, the Inquisition are amongst those few. Bodt had been the planet where Angron had officially taken command of what was then the War Hounds. This marked it, of course, as somewhat special in the Legion's history, but beyond that, it wasn't all that much to write home about. It was a minor mustering world, and due to its closeness with the Legion, its populace also grew to become rather savage in their own rights. And the Legion did draw both recruits and Solar Auxilia troops from Bodt. But it was only after all of this, and when Angron began to conspire with Horus, that the planet took on a more sinister aspect. Bodt became a secret testing ground for the Dark Mechanicus. a place where they tried to perfect and manufacture en masse the butcher's nails. Lesser versions of those implanted in Angron's own brain when he was a slave. Given time, the nails would drive anyone into madness and a berserk killing rage that knew nothing but bloodshed. Unsurprisingly, the Imperium at best frowned upon this technology, and so the implementation of large-scale manufacturing and implanting of butcher's nails was best done in secret. Furthermore, Bodt also became a planet where they experimented with the creation of a new type of Astartes, something similar to the Raptors. Using secret technology, possibly even stolen from the Raven Guard and based upon the Raptors' formula. As a result of this, the World Eaters became able to mass-produce Space Marines on a hitherto unknown scale. Instead of the process being a long and careful one that could take years and years, the World Eaters were now producing battle-ready Space Marines in the course of mere months. Worse still, they were implanting them with the memories of other World Eaters, creating remarkably efficient and completely and utterly merciless killing machines. Every single one of which, of course, was also implanted with the butcher's nails. This was an incredibly volatile technology, however. The combination of the nails, the rapid growth formula, and the psycho-indoctrination caused enormous casualties. But if you could get even one fully fledged Astartes out of 100 mortals, that was a ratio more than good enough for the World Eaters. And by the time the Red Talon descended on Bodt, over 10,000 World Eaters were ready on the planet. If given more time, the World Eaters could have become one of the most populous of legions, and it would have furnished the Horus heresy with tens of thousands new soldiers. Autek Mor might have won the war in that single engagement, or at the very least prevented a terrible situation from becoming even worse. As for the mysterious canister of stasis-sealed gene technology recovered by Autek Mor, no one quite knows what it was. Perhaps it was the Raptor formula. It makes a certain amount of sense. The Alpha Legion managed to steal it, after all, from the Raven Guard. Perhaps intending to sow yet further dissent within the traitors, they gave it to the World Eaters. Perhaps intending to carry out the plans of the Eldar Masters? Perhaps that is slightly too harsh a term. They figured they would boost the power of the least controllable of the legions, ensuring that the Horus heresy, after its eventual victory, would simply descend into bloodshed and uncontrollable anarchy, burning the light of humanity out in one brief but brilliant flash. Or perhaps the World Eaters' Dark Mechanicus had happened upon something quite remarkable all by their lonesome. Perhaps they'd even robbed the corpse of Ferrus Manus to do so. Perhaps that was what in the canister. Some sliver of the Iron Hand's Primarch. That would explain, perhaps even more so than the threat of tens of thousands of World Eaters, why Autek Mor, who had proven himself to quite possibly be amongst the most loyal of all Iron Hands, would risk everything to retrieve it. Regardless of what the truth really was, Autek Mor, his clan Moragul, and his shattered legion was not done yet. They would continue to harass the leading edge of the traitors all the way up until the death of Horus Lupercal and the commencement of the Imperial counter-offensive. finally relieved and reinforced by breakthrough elements of the leading edge of the Imperium's great scouring of the galaxy, they could finally return to the Imperium, where, despite all their efforts, no hero's welcome awaited them. To be fair, Autek Mor was not a man inclined to bragging, and the further actions of his shattered legion went mostly unrecorded. But there were clearly those who had been paying attention, which is why Autek Mor was granted the singular honor of forming one of the new Space Marine chapters from the ranks of the much-depleted Iron Hands. Once more, Autek gathered around himself the misfits, the outcasts, the violent few that could find no other home amongst the stars, and brought them aboard the Red Talon, and named them in honor of the warship that had carried him safely through countless engagements and had allowed him to enact his vengeance upon the traitors. And that was not the only holdover. The deep crimson color of the Red Talon's new armor was taken from Autek Mor's elites, the Blood-wrought, and their insignia from Clan Muragul. The Red Talons would also adopt their shattered Legion forebearers' tactics and strategies. Focus on extreme ferocity, ruthless assaults, and unrelenting offensives, preferably against traitors. Now, after the Great Scouring, of course, the Imperium thought for a while that chaos was defeated. Not quite so, and even when chaos lay relatively dormant within the eye, there were plentiful other issues to deal with as well, such as the War of the False Primarch in the 33rd millennium. This is a conflict that has been hushed up very effectively by the Inquisition and everyone involved. But what we do know is that 5 particularly favoured chapters, and with reputations for ruthlessness, the Carcharodonts, Charnelgar, Death Eagles, Flesh Eaters, and the Red Talons, were all deployed to eradicate 11 other chapters of the Adeptus Astartes. Which they did, and most crucially of all, without asking any questions. They were traitors, after all. What more information could they possibly require? This campaign, and others like it, cemented the Red Talon's reputations as the High Lord's attack dogs, a chapter willing and able, gleeful even, to do whatever was required to keep the Imperium pure, for they had seen what heresy meant. They had seen the consequences of allowing betrayal and ambitions to run rampant throughout the Imperium. And the Red Talons are not going to allow that to happen again. Whenever possible, however, they prefer to persecute their old foes, the traitor Legion Astartes and Chaos cultists, whom they will go to great lengths to hunt down and destroy, utilizing the very tactics the Red Talons themselves perfected, in reverse, of course, when harassing the traitors' rear lines. They know what targets would be appealing to a raiding warfleet. They know what areas might be most susceptible, and they know the warp routes most likely to be picked to convey the enemy, so that the Red Talons can always be a step or two ahead. They also do not shirk from carrying out extensive and long-term campaigns against major enemy heretical holdings, picking apart entire miniature empires of cultists, one planet, one supply route, one ammunition dump, one force concentration at a time. And helping them in these endeavors is a significant naval component, Possessing at least one battle bard and 2 confirmed strike cruisers, in addition to several more, the Red Talons are a powerful naval chapter, which they're going to need to be, as their favoured method of offence is also massed armoured formations, retaining the speed and ferocity for which they are famous. Now, whether or not the Red Talon itself still prowls the warp alongside its namesakes is unclear. It's far from impossible. Many of the vessels in the Imperium are incredibly old. But surviving 10,000 years of the sort of high-intensity warfare for which the Red Talons are justly famous, well, that might be a bit of a long shot. Particularly considering the Red Talon's habit of picking the harshest of opponents, actively going after Chaos Space Marines and heretical Astartes en masse, uprooting their little personal fiefdoms and miniature empires, or chasing down their raiding fleets, even getting involved in major conflicts at the direct behest of the High Lords themselves. And yet, despite being engaged in so many high-intensity conflicts, the Red Talons are still a vital force even today in the modern 41st millennium, as their merciless and aggressive tactics have proven successful again and again, and their ranks continuously replenished by their home world of Rykon, where fresh generations of neophyte adepts are taught the lessons of Autek Mor, the history of the Red Talons, of the Shattered Legions, and how a few stood against many to avert disaster and save the Imperium. For whilst the God Emperor most certainly does protect, it is the Red Talon that reaps his foes. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.